You want to open the floor to a discussion about corruption, Professor? So let's have a real conversation about how your wife managed to secure $1.5 million just by making a single phone call. Jamie Raskin nervously adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and tried to smooth down the front of his professorial tweed jacket as the tension in the room spiked. In stark contrast, Trump stood there looking completely relaxed in his signature red tie and dark suit, wearing that specific expression he gets when he knows he holds the winning hand. On the small table right beside him sat 3 thick manila folders, and each one was labeled with a single ominous word that read evidence. Sarah Bloom Raskin places a personal call directly to Esther George, the president of the Kansas City Fed, and suddenly, almost miraculously, Reserve Trust's second application gets approved in 2018 after being stalled. $1.5 million, folks. That is exactly what Sarah sold her shares for in December of 2000, which means nearly 200,000 shares were gone and instantly turned into hard cash. This document right here is Jamie's financial disclosure form that was filed in August of 2021. And I want you to take a very close look at the date stamped on it. From December 18th of 2020 all the way to August of 2021 is a span of 8 months, Jamie, where your wife sells nearly 200,000 shares for a massive payday. You waited 8 full months to tell anyone about this transaction, keeping the public completely in the dark about where that money came from. We lost our son during that period, Raskin said quietly, his voice barely rising above a whisper as the room fell into a heavy silence. For a brief moment, a look of genuine sympathy crossed Trump's face, acknowledging the personal tragedy before shifting back to the political reality of the situation at hand. But Jaime, during that exact same time period, you were actively leading the charge on the second impeachment proceeding against me. You clearly had the time and the focus to try and impeach a sitting president. Yet you claim you didn't have the time to file a simple 2-page disclosure form about your wife's $1 million payday. Let's go through the numbers, folks, and let's talk about what Jaime actually makes while he is busy lecturing working Americans about economic justice and fair shares. His congressional salary alone clocks in at $174,000 per year, which is already far more than most people will see. Then you add in his salary from American University as a law professor, which is estimated to be another $90,000 per year on top of his government pay to Pomai. Don't forget the book deals that bring in approximately $100,000 per year, padding his bank account even further. Speaking fees vary, of course, but let's be conservative and say that is another $50,000 per year, bringing us to a very substantial total. That is $414,000, meaning Jaime makes 5.5 times what the average American family brings home in an entire year. The Raskin family home in Tacoma Park, Maryland, was a beautiful Victorian mansion that was clearly worth millions to anyone who drove past it. This is where Jamie lives, and property records show it is worth about $2.3 million, which puts him in an entirely different bracket from his constituents. Jamie's house is worth 6.5 times more than the average American home, yet he speaks as if he understands the struggles of the common man. "Sir, would you please stand up?" The gentleman sitting back there in the 5th row, so everyone can see you. "My name is Robert Henderson. I am from Pennsylvania, and on January 6th, 2021, I walked through the Capitol building for about 20 minutes. I didn't break a single thing. I didn't hurt anyone, and I was just there witnessing what was happening. 2 months later, the FBI raided my home at 6 in the morning with 15 agents who were armed like I was a dangerous terrorist. They put me in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day in a cell, treating me like a threat to national security. Jamie, Mr. Henderson was prosecuted by the same Justice Department that you praised for its thorough investigation, so I have to ask you a question. Does this man look like a violent insurrectionist to you? Or does he look like a citizen who was caught up in a political machine? You destroyed evidence, Jamie, because your committee deleted thousands of hours of witness testimony that didn't fit the story you wanted to tell. You refused to include testimony that contradicted your narrative because the truth would have derailed the entire production you were running. Let's talk about Jamie's holy war against Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas and the standards he tries to apply to others. Justice Thomas, over a period of 20 years, received gifts from a friend named Harlan Crow, which has been blown up into a major scandal. Thomas received $2 million in gifts over 20 years from a personal friend, while Raskin pocketed $1.5 million in a stock sale after one phone call in just 2 years. You accused Thomas of financial corruption, while your wife got rich from government connections that were unavailable to anyone else. You accuse Republicans of political persecution, while you ran show trials that were designed to destroy your opponents without due process. Everything you accuse others of doing, you are actually guilty of yourself, and the American people are finally starting to see through the projection. The silence that followed that statement wasn't just quiet. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that sucks the air right out of a room and leaves everyone holding their breath. Trump didn't rush to fill the void. Instead, he let the weight of the accusation hang there, allowing the cameras to zoom in on Raskin's shifting demeanor. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the exposure of a system that operates by a completely different set of rules for the people sitting in those velvet chairs. While the media scrambles to fact-check every syllable uttered by a conservative, they seem to lose their reading glasses entirely when a progressive power couple turns public service into a private gold mine. You talk about preserving the sanctity of our institutions, but the only institution you seem interested in preserving is the one that prints money for your family. Let's peel back the layers of this onion, because the deeper you go, the more it stings the eyes of the average taxpayer who is struggling just to fill their gas tank. The issue with Reserve Trust wasn't just that they got approved, it was that they were the only ones who got the golden key to the master account. This master account is the holy grail of banking, giving a fintech company direct access to the Federal Reserve's plumbing without the oversight of a traditional bank. Sarah Bloom Raskin didn't just make a phone call, she leveraged decades of insider knowledge to bypass the hurdles that block every other competitor in the market. It is the classic definition of the revolving door, where government officials leave office only to turn around and sell their access to the highest bidder. Think about the message this sends to every small business owner in America who spends their nights drowning in paperwork and regulatory red tape. They follow every rule, they dot every I and cross every T, yet they live in fear that one minor clerical error could destroy their livelihood. Meanwhile, the Raskin family operates in a stratosphere where a rejection is just a temporary suggestion that can be overturned with the right network. When the first application was denied, most people would have packed up and gone home. But not when you have a former Deputy Secretary of the Treasury on your speed dial. The reversal of that decision wasn't magic. It was a transaction of influence that converted political capital into actual capital. Now look back at Robert Henderson, a man whose life was upended not because he was a mastermind of chaos, but because he walked through an open door and took a selfie. While Jamie Raskin was seemingly too busy to file his financial disclosures because of his grief, the machinery of the state had plenty of time to hunt down a grandmother in Indiana or a veteran in Pennsylvania. The juxtaposition here is not just unfair, it is a grotesque mockery of the very concept of equal justice under the law. We have a two-tiered justice system where one side gets their home raided at dawn by tactical teams, and the other side gets a polite reminder letter from the Ethics Committee years after the fact. If you want to know why people are angry, Jamie, it isn't because of what happened on one specific day in January. It is because of what happens every single day in the halls of Congress. You sit there with your committee, selectively editing videos and curating a narrative that paints half the country as domestic enemies, while you yourself are the beneficiary of the swamp you claim to be draining. The American people are not stupid. They can see the difference between a political witch hunt and a legitimate inquiry, and they know which one they are watching right now. When you accused Justice Thomas of corruption, you set a standard that you yourself cannot possibly meet, and now that the mirror is turned around, you don't like the reflection. Justice Thomas has been a servant of the law for decades, and his friendships are being criminalized by people who have turned their actual government service into a lucrative family business. The hypocrisy is so thick you could cut it with a knife, yet you expect us to swallow your moral sermons without choking. Let's talk about the specific timeline again, because in the world of high finance and political maneuvering, timing is absolutely everything, and there are no coincidences. While you were drafting articles of impeachment, claiming that the country was on the brink of collapse, your household was quietly finalizing a deal that would secure your financial future. It takes a special kind of compartmentalization to scream about the end of democracy in the morning and then check your stock portfolio in the afternoon. Most Americans, when they are going through a tragedy or a crisis, barely have the energy to get out of bed, let alone orchestrate high-level financial maneuvers. But for the political elite in Washington, a crisis is often just another opportunity to consolidate power and diversify assets while the public is distracted. The media played their part perfectly, focusing all their lenses on the drama you were directing in the House chamber, conveniently ignoring the transactions happening in your bank account. If a Republican had failed to disclose a $1 million windfall for 8 months, it would have been the lead story on every network from New York to Los Angeles. They would have demanded resignations, they would have launched special investigations, and they would have camped outside your house until they got an answer. But for Jamie Raskin, the press acted less like watchdogs and more like a public relations firm, burying the story in the back pages if they covered it at all. This protection racket is the only reason you are still sitting in that chair instead of answering questions under oath about your own conduct. We need to address the fundamental question of why a fintech company would pay that much money for advice, unless that advice included a guarantee of results. You don't pay a board member that kind of equity just for their brilliant legal mind. You pay them for their Rolodex and their ability to get the decision-maker on the phone. Esther George at the Kansas City Fed didn't take that call because she was lonely. She took it because she knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. It creates an ecosystem where merit is irrelevant, and connections are the only currency that matters, locking out innovation in favor of nepotism. This is the exact type of crony capitalism that destroys faith in the free market and convinces young people that the game is rigged before they even roll the dice. You have spent your entire career lecturing the country about equity and fairness, using those words as a shield to deflect from your own privilege. The Victorian mansion in Tacoma Park isn't just a house. It is a monument to a career spent in the lucrative intersection of law, academia, and government. While you advocate for policies that often make it harder for the working class to build wealth, you have utilized every loophole available to insulate your own fortune. It is easy to preach about redistribution when your own assets are safely tucked away in trusts and stock options that the average worker can't even access. The disconnect between your rhetoric and your reality is the reason why your polling numbers are crumbling and why the people are tuning you out. This goes beyond just one man or one family. It exposes a structural rot that has infected the entire body politic of Washington, D.C. We are watching a class of people who believe they are the rulers rather than the representatives, entitled to the spoils of office as if it were a birthright. They weaponize the Department of Justice to settle political scores, creating crimes where there are none, while ignoring actual influence peddling right under their noses. The American people are tired of being told that they are the problem, that their questions are dangerous, and that their desire for transparency is a threat to the Republic. The real threat to the Republic is a ruling class that believes it is above the law. And today, Hamey, that belief is being put on trial. Look at the faces of the people in this room. Look past the cameras and the reporters, and look at the staff and the regular folks who make this building run. They know the truth because they see it every day. They see who walks through the VIP entrances and who gets stopped at the metal detectors. They know that if they delayed a financial disclosure by 8 months, they would be fired and possibly prosecuted, not given a pass because of who they are. You have lost the moral high ground, Professor. And once you lose that in politics, it is a very long and slippery slide down to the bottom. The evidence in these folders is not just paper. It is a roadmap of how the sausage is made. And unfortunately for you, the public has finally lost its appetite. Let's circle back to the attacks on Justice Clarence Thomas, because that is where your projection reaches truly delusional levels, exposing the double standard that has become your trademark. You and your colleagues have spent months dragging a man's reputation through the mud because he has a wealthy friend who likes to treat him to vacations. You scream about ethics and impropriety, painting a picture of a judge who is for sale. Yet you conveniently ignore the fundamental difference between friendship and business. Harlan Crow didn't have a massive application pending before the Supreme Court that Thomas pushed through. He was just a friend being a friend. But in your case, the money that flowed into your household wasn't a gift. It was a direct result of a regulatory green light that your wife helped engineer. You want to talk about conflicts of interest? Let's talk about the difference between a billionaire taking a friend fishing and a regulator opening the floodgates for a fintech company. One is a personal relationship that you may not like, but the other is a transactional exchange that directly enriched your family bank account by over $1 million. You sit there with a straight face and lecture the country about the sanctity of public service while your own pockets are lined with the proceeds of the very influence peddling you claim to despise. It takes a staggering amount of arrogance to point a finger at a Supreme Court justice while you are standing on a mountain of questionable stock options. The American people can see that you aren't actually interested in ethics. You are only interested in weaponizing ethics as a political bludgeon to take down your enemies. This is the classic definition of psychological projection, Jamie, where you accuse your opponent of the exact sins that you yourself are committing in the dark. You accuse Republicans of undermining democracy. Yet you ran a committee that stripped away the minority party's right to choose their own members and cross-examine witnesses. You accuse conservatives of spreading disinformation. Yet you carefully curated a timeline that omitted any evidence that exonerated the people you wanted to convict in the court of public opinion. Everything you claim to be fighting against is actually looking right back at you in the mirror. Every single morning when you tie that tie. You have become the very thing you warned us about, a politician who believes that the rules are just obstacles for the little people to navigate while you soar above them. The folder on the table labeled evidence isn't just a prop. It is a receipt for every lecture you have ever given and every moral stance you have ever faked. When you go home tonight to that beautiful Victorian mansion, Ask yourself if the average worker in your district feels represented by a man who plays the stock market with insider leverage. They are worried about the price of eggs and whether they can afford rent, while you are worried about how to spin the next narrative to distract from your own financial disclosures. The disconnect is palpable, and it is the reason why the populist movement isn't going away, no matter how many investigations you launch or how many subpoenas you issue. You can try to arrest the dissenters and silence the critics, but you cannot arrest the truth when it is written in black and white on your own tax forms. History is not going to look kindly on this era of show trials and selective outrage, and it certainly won't be kind to the architects of this hypocrisy. You thought you could use the January 6th committee as a sword to cut down your political opposition, but you grabbed the blade by the wrong end, and now you are bleeding credibility. The tragic irony is that by trying so hard to criminalize politics, you have exposed the actual criminal nature of the cronyism that runs this town. You wanted a spotlight, Professor. Well, congratulations. You have got one now. But it is shining on the parts of your life you desperately wanted to keep in the shadows. The room felt smaller now, the air thin and electric, as if the sheer weight of the facts had physically compressed the space between the two men. Raskin remained silent, his professorial demeanor cracking under the relentless barrage of financial specifics that no amount of rhetoric could explain away. It wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a dismantling of a carefully constructed public image, piece by jagged piece. Trump leaned forward, placing his hand on the stack of folders, signaling that the presentation was over, but the consequences were just beginning. You have spent your time hunting ghosts and demons, Hamey, but the real specter haunting this government is the greed that disguises itself as virtue. The American people are done with the theater. They are done with the fake outrage, and they are certainly done with politicians who get rich while the country gets poor. This is not just about you or your wife, or even this specific deal. It is about breaking the wheel of corruption that crushes the average citizen while lifting up the elite. You have given us all a masterclass in how the system is rigged, not by the people protesting outside, but by the people sitting comfortably inside these chambers. As the reality of the situation settled in, the difference between a polished politician and a force of nature became undeniably clear to everyone in the room. You can keep your gavel and your committee, but you have lost the argument. And more importantly, you have lost the trust of the people you swore to serve. The folders remained on the table, a silent testament to a game that was finally being called out, as the rest of the room began to understand that the hunter had just become the hunted. The energy in the room had shifted irrevocably, transforming from a tense inquiry into a scene of total political devastation where the accuser had been stripped of all authority. Raskin stared blankly at the polished mahogany table, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of a notepad that remained conspicuously empty of any rebuttal. There was no witty retort left in the arsenal, no academic precedent to cite, and no way to intellectualize the raw numbers that painted a picture of undeniable greed. The three manila folders stood like monoliths between them, physical manifestations of the truth that could no longer be swept under the rug of partisan politics. For years, the strategy had been to attack, to deflect, and to investigate until the target was destroyed. But that strategy relies entirely on the attacker being beyond reproach. When you live in a glass house, Hamey, you really shouldn't be the one throwing stones at the people standing outside, especially when those stones are stripping away the foundations of your own credibility. The reporters in the back of the room, usually so eager to shout questions and shape the narrative, were suddenly busy checking their phones or looking down, uncomfortable with witnessing the collapse of their preferred storyline. They knew that what had just happened couldn't be spun, couldn't be edited, and couldn't be ignored without completely abandoning their duty to the public. The camera lens captures the truth even when the commentary tries to lie. And today, the camera captured a man who ran out of excuses. You can't impeach the truth, and you certainly can't sanction reality just because it doesn't fit into your committee's final report. This moment right here is why the establishment is so terrified of transparency. Because transparency levels the playing field and takes away the advantage of the insider class. You thought you could operate in the dark while shining a flashlight in everyone else's face. But someone finally turned the lights on in the entire building. The American dream is supposed to be about hard work and innovation, not about using a government Rolodex to bypass the rules that apply to everyone else. When a steelworker in Pennsylvania sees that you can make 10 times his annual salary with a single phone call, something breaks in the social contract that holds this country together. You are not protecting democracy by enriching yourself. You are selling it off, piece by piece, to the highest bidder while wrapping yourself in the flag. Trump stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket with a deliberate calmness that signaled the conversation was over and the verdict was already in. He didn't need to shout anymore, because the facts had screamed louder than any political speech ever could. Leave the folders there, Jaime. Take a good look at them, and maybe read them on your way back to that mansion in Maryland. It is time for this committee to pack up its circus tent and go home, because the people have seen behind the curtain and they are not impressed with the wizard anymore. As he turned to leave, the silence was finally broken, not by a gavel or a shout, but by the heavy realization that the balance of power had just tipped back toward the people. Walking out of the chamber, the contrast was striking. One man walked with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide, while the other remained seated in the shadow of his own hypocrisy. The narrative of the last few years, the insurrectionist claims, the moral posturing, the endless investigations, crumpled under the weight of a simple financial disclosure form. It turns out that the greatest threat to our institutions wasn't the loud protests outside the gates, but the quiet transactions happening inside the offices. The legacy of this moment won't be the committee's findings. It will be the exposure of a two-tiered system that is finally crumbling under the pressure of the truth. Justice is coming, not the kind you weaponize against your opponents, but the kind that restores faith in the idea that no one, not even a powerful congressman, is above the law. The quiet aftermath of that confrontation in the hearing room reverberated far beyond the physical walls of the Capitol building, signaling a shift in the tectonic plates of Washington politics. For decades, the unspoken rule in this town was that you could attack a politician's policies or their voting record, but you never pulled back the curtain on how they accumulated their personal wealth. Raskin's stunned silence wasn't just the reaction of a man who had lost a debate. It was the realization that the old gentleman's agreement among the ruling class had been permanently shredded. The manila folders on the table represented a breach of protocol that terrified the establishment, because if the public starts looking at the bank accounts, the entire game collapses. We are witnessing the end of the era where moral superiority could be used as a currency to purchase immunity from scrutiny, and the panic is starting to set in. Let's take a microscope to the concept of the master account at the Federal Reserve, because the technical complexity of it is exactly what they use to hide the corruption from the average voter. Most Americans have no idea what a master account is, but for a financial institution, it is the difference between being a local player and having a direct pipeline to the global economy. When Sarah Bloom Raskin made that call, she wasn't just asking for a favor. She was asking for access to the central nervous system of the American banking world. This is a privilege usually reserved for chartered banks that undergo rigorous stress tests and oversight. Not for a novelty fintech startup looking to make a quick buck. By bypassing these safeguards, they didn't just break the rules, they endangered the stability of the financial system to pad their own portfolio. Think about the sheer audacity required to sit on a committee investigating the attack on democracy while you are actively subverting the democratic safeguards of our financial institutions. They tell you that democracy is under threat from guys like Robert Henderson walking through a hallway. But they never tell you it is under threat from unelected bureaucrats handing out golden keys to their spouses. The real insurrection isn't happening with flags and face paint. It is happening in quiet offices with mahogany desks where regulations are rewritten to benefit the friends of the powerful. This is the banality of evil in its modern form, where the destruction of public trust is carried out through administrative loopholes and delayed disclosure forms. They have created a labyrinth of bureaucracy so complex that they think you will get too tired to follow the money. But they underestimated the American attention span. Now we have to address the media's role in this cover-up because their silence is louder and more damning than any defense Raskin could possibly offer. If a conservative politician's wife had made $1.5 million from a phone call to a Trump appointee, it would be the headline on the New York Times for 6 months straight. There would be graphics explaining the timeline, interviews with ethics experts, and demands for a special counsel to investigate the obvious conflict of interest. But for the Raskin family, the press acts like a palace guard, deflecting inquiries and framing any legitimate questions as conspiracy theories or political harassment. This is not journalism. This is state-sponsored propaganda designed to protect the chosen few while ruthlessly hunting down the political outsiders. Consider the plight of the small business owner in Ohio or the farmer in Iowa who can't even get a loan approved to fix their tractor because of rising interest rates. They play by the rules, they pay their taxes on time, and they pray that the economy doesn't crash, while their representatives are gambling with the system that controls their livelihood. When Raskin delayed his financial disclosure by 8 months, he wasn't just being forgetful. He was denying his constituents the critical information they needed to judge his integrity. During those 8 months, he was casting votes that affected the stock market, affected banking regulations, and affected the very inflation that is crushing the working class. It is the ultimate form of insider trading, where the information isn't just stolen, it is legislated into existence by the people holding the gavel. The comparison to Justice Clarence Thomas is not just a side note in this saga, it is the fulcrum upon which their entire moral argument shatters into 1,000 pieces. They hunted Thomas for accepting hospitality from a friend who asked for nothing in return, creating a standard of purity that no human being could possibly meet. Yet, when that same standard is applied to their own transactional relationships involving actual regulatory decisions, they cry foul and claim they are being persecuted. This double standard is what infuriates the public more than the corruption itself, because it treats the voters like they are too stupid to see the contradiction. They believe they own the moral high ground by default, regardless of their actions, operating like medieval aristocracy rather than public servants. Let's look deeper into the tragedy of the two-tiered justice system that allowed Robert Henderson to be treated like a terrorist while the Raskin family was treated like royalty. Henderson, a man with no criminal history, had his life turned upside down, his privacy invaded, and his reputation destroyed for the crime of being in the wrong place. Meanwhile, the people who actually wield power use the Department of Justice as their private security firm, shielding them from the consequences of their own questionable dealings. It sends a chilling message to every citizen. If you are part of the elite, the law is a shield. If you are a dissident, the law is a weapon. This is not the rule of law that the founders envisioned. It is the rule of rulers, and it is antithetical to everything the Constitution stands for. The financial disparity highlighted in the transcript, the 5.5 times the average income, the 6.5 times the average home value, is not just about jealousy, it is about detachability. When you live in a multi-million-dollar Victorian mansion in a protected enclave, you are insulated from the consequences of the policies you push on the rest of the country. You don't feel the sting of gas prices, you don't worry about crime in your neighborhood, and you certainly don't worry about your small business being regulated out of existence. This detachment allows politicians like Raskin to preach about abstract concepts of justice while totally ignoring the economic reality on the ground. They are playing a video game with the American economy where they have unlimited lives and cheat codes, while the rest of us are playing for survival. We must also scrutinize the timeline of the excuse regarding the loss of his son, which is a tragedy that demands respect, but cannot be used as a permanent get-out-of-jail-free card. Genuine grief is heartbreaking, but selective grief that only excuses financial noncompliance while allowing for aggressive political impeachment campaigns is suspicious. If you are well enough to lead a high-stakes legal battle to remove a president, you are well enough to sign a 2-page form that your accountant probably prepared for you. Using a family tragedy to deflect from ethical questions is a cynical maneuver that weaponizes sympathy to shut down legitimate inquiry. It puts the public in an impossible position where asking for accountability is framed as being heartless, which is exactly the calculated outcome they wanted. The revolving door is spinning so fast in Washington that it is generating enough wind to blow away the last remnants of integrity in our federal government. Sarah Bloom Raskin went from the Treasury to the board of a fintech company and then tried to go back to the Fed, carrying her bag of connections with her. This isn't public service. It is a career path designed to monetize government experience at the expense of the taxpayer. They enter office with modest wealth and leave as multi-millionaires, and nobody is allowed to ask how the math works without being labeled a conspiracy theorist. The system is designed to be self-perpetuating, where the regulators and the regulated are the same people, just wearing different suits on different days. And what about the evidence that was destroyed, the deleted testimonies that didn't fit the narrative of the January 6th committee? In a court of law, destruction of evidence is a felony that implies consciousness of guilt. Yet here it is treated as a simple administrative decision. They deleted the voices that contradicted their story because they knew their story was too fragile to withstand the weight of the whole truth. It was never about finding out what happened. It was about producing a television show for prime time that would criminalize the opposition party. They edited reality to fit a script, and now that the raw footage is coming out, the producers of that show are scrambling to cover their tracks. The American people are waking up to the realization that the experts who run their lives are not smarter or more moral than them. They are just more connected. The aura of invincibility that surrounded these technocrats is fading as the receipts are brought into the light of day. They told us to trust the science, trust the experts, and trust the process. But every time we look under the hood, we find a mechanism rigged for their benefit. The skepticism that is sweeping the nation is not a symptom of ignorance. It is a symptom of pattern recognition by a population that is tired of being lied to. We are watching the slow-motion collapse of the credibility of the entire managerial class. This is why the confrontation over the Raskin finances is so critical. It is the thread that, if pulled hard enough, unravels the entire sweater of DC corruption. It exposes the lie that these people are fighting for democracy, showing instead that they are fighting to preserve a hierarchy where they stay on top. They are terrified of the populist movement not because it is dangerous to the country, but because it is dangerous to their business model. When you understand that politics is their business and power is their product, everything else starts to make sense. They aren't trying to save the republic. They are trying to save their quarterly earnings and their cocktail party invitations. As we move forward from this revelation, the question is no longer, did they do it, but what are we going to do about it as a citizenry? We cannot rely on the Department of Justice to investigate itself, and we cannot rely on the corporate media to report on their friends. The responsibility falls on independent voices and the new media landscape to keep the pressure on and refuse to let the story die. They are banking on our exhaustion, banking on the news cycle moving on to the next distraction. But this time feels different. The evidence is too concrete. The hypocrisy is too glaring. And the economic pain of the average American is too real to be ignored. The final verdict on the legacy of Jamie Raskin and his cohorts will not be written by the historians they pay, but by the people they betrayed. The folders on that table are just the beginning of a reckoning that has been delayed for far too long. We are entering a new phase of American politics where the old guards are being forced to answer for decades of self-dealing. The silence in that room was the sound of a power structure, realizing that its time is running out. And as the sun sets on their era of unchecked privilege, a new day is dawning where transparency is not just a request, but a demand. We need to deconstruct the specific psychology of the credentialed class that Jamie Raskin represents, because it is the root cause of the disconnect between the government and the governed. They honestly believe that their degrees from elite universities and their tenured positions give them a divine right to rule over the unwashed masses who didn't go to Ivy League schools. In their minds, the rules are necessary constraints for the common people to prevent chaos, but those same rules are merely suggestions for the enlightened elite who know better. When Raskin violated the Stock Act by failing to disclose his wife's windfall, he didn't see it as a crime. He likely saw it as a minor administrative oversight beneath his station. This arrogance is what allows them to look a frantic single mother in the eye and tell her that the economy is great while she can't afford to buy milk. The complexity of the financial system is not a bug. It is a feature designed to keep the average citizen from understanding how they are being robbed in broad daylight. They use terms like quantitative easing and fintech regulatory sandbox to make your eyes glaze over so you stop asking questions about where the money is actually going. Sarah Bloom Raskin's maneuvering wasn't just a business deal, it was a masterclass in using bureaucratic language to camouflage a massive transfer of wealth. If a guy in a trench coat took $1 million out of a bank vault, we would call it a robbery and send the police. But when a former official uses a loophole to extract $1 million from the market, we call it consulting and give them a seat on a board of directors. This brings us to the terrifying reality of the uniparty, where the supposed opposition between Democrats and Republicans is often just theater for the television cameras. Behind closed doors at the cocktail parties in Georgetown, they laugh at the voters who actually believe the partisan fighting is real. They attend the same weddings, send their children to the same private schools, and protect each other's financial interests regardless of what they say on the House floor. Raskin didn't fear exposure from his colleagues because he knows that if you start flipping over rocks in D.C., you are going to find dirt on everyone. The silence of the establishment, Republicans during this scandal, is just as deafening as the deflection from the Democrats, proving that the protection racket crosses party lines. Let's talk about the weaponization of the term expert, which has been used to bludgeon dissent and shut down legitimate debate on everything from the economy to public health. They tell us that we must listen to the experts, but they conveniently ignore the fact that many of these experts are on the payroll of the very industries they are supposed to regulate. When an expert like Sarah Bloom Raskin says that a fintech company is safe for the financial system, She isn't speaking as a neutral observer. She is speaking as a paid stakeholder. The phrase, "trust the science," or "trust the experts," has become a shield to hide conflicts of interest that would make a mafia boss blush. It is an appeal to authority designed to make you feel stupid for trusting your own eyes and your own bank account statement. The utter destruction of the FBI's reputation is collateral damage in their war to maintain power, and it is a tragedy that will haunt this country for generations. We used to look at federal agents as the ultimate symbol of law and order, untainted by the dirty game of politics. But when we see them raiding the home of a peaceful protester like Robert Henderson while ignoring the financial irregularities of a congressman, that image is shattered forever. They have turned the premier law enforcement agency of the world into a private police force for the ruling party, used to intimidate political enemies. You cannot have a free society when the people with the guns and the badges are taking orders from the people with the skeletons in their closets. There is also a profound irony in how Raskin and his cohorts constantly preach about the dangers of misinformation while they are the primary architects of false narratives. They told us the laptop was Russian disinformation. They told us the economy was transitory. And they told us that their investigations were nonpartisan. Every single one of those claims turned out to be false. Yet, there has been zero accountability and zero apologies issued to the American people. They believe that they have the right to lie to us for our own good, manipulating the truth to guide the ignorant public toward the correct outcome. This is not democracy. This is information warfare waged by a government against its own citizens to maintain control. We are watching the formation of a permanent aristocracy in America, where political seats are treated like family heirlooms passed down through bloodlines or marriage. Look at how many spouses, children, and relatives of powerful politicians end up in lucrative positions that they are completely unqualified for. The Raskin family is just one example of a much larger ecosystem where your last name is more important than your resume or your character. It creates a closed loop where fresh ideas and actual talent are locked out, leaving us with a stagnant leadership class that is totally out of touch with reality. This incestuous dynamic is why nothing ever changes in Washington, because change is bad for the family business. The economic pain that is ravaging the middle class is the direct result of policies implemented by people who are insulated from the consequences of their own decisions. When they print trillions of dollars to bail out their donors and fund their pet projects, they cause the inflation that eats away at your savings. Raskin doesn't feel the price of gas because he has a congressional salary and $1 million stock portfolio to cushion the blow. They treat the economy like a laboratory experiment, playing with people's livelihoods from the comfort of their ivory towers. And when the experiment fails and people lose their homes, they just shrug their shoulders and blame it on market forces or foreign conflicts. This entire saga exposes the hollowness of their equity agenda, which is nothing more than a marketing slogan to cover up their rampant greed. They talk endlessly about racial and social justice, but their actions only serve to consolidate wealth in the hands of the predominantly white, liberal elite. They use the language of the oppressed to expand the power of the oppressor, hijacking legitimate social movements to shield themselves from criticism. If you question Raskin's finances, you are attacked as being against their values, a clever trap that silences dissent by claiming the moral high ground. It is a cynical game where they use the suffering of others as a prop to advance their own careers. Ultimately, the folders on the table represent the bill coming due for a ruling class that has lived on credit for far too long. You can only ignore the will of the people for so long before the pressure builds to a breaking point that no amount of spin can contain. The populist uprising we are seeing is not a temporary temper tantrum. It is a structural realignment of American politics against the corruption of the Uni Party. They are terrified because they know they have no defense against the truth when it is presented clearly and without filters. The era of the gatekeepers is over, and the era of accountability is just beginning, whether Jamie Raskin likes it or not.